Is the era of Nintendo experimentalism in games finished? Is the future one of increasingly more polished and expansive, but also more soulless and expensive titles? And did a 20th century French theorist predict this for Nintendo decades ago? In this video, I want to look a little at Nintendo's current predicament through something called genre theory, a philosophy that French film critical theorist Christian Metz first put forward, stating that film genres go through a cycle during their lifetime. Then we're going to use this to examine what we can learn about Nintendo and its current output on Switch 2. So, what is genre theory? The concept was intended to apply to film genres and describes the stages that films go through when a new genre emerges. First, you have the experimental phase. This is the time when everything is brand new and the conventions that come to define the, in our case, game series are set. It's not difficult to identify this time period for Nintendo titles, with the 1980s being the experimental launch of Mario, Zelda, and Metroid, among others, although evidently there are many other games and indeed new genres being discovered all the time. Although these rules were intended for broad genres rather than specific series of films, or in our case, series of games, I do think the Mario series is a good way to explore how these changes apply, and we can see how, right at the beginning, the Lost Levels was evidently a false step, and Nintendo quickly iterated and formed what is in the West Super Mario Bros. 3, which was much closer to the next stage of what Mario should have been. This was the formation of the new conventions of Mario. The second stage, therefore, is the classic phase. Here, the conventions are established and become part of the fun. So here we have Super Mario Bros. 3 becoming Super Mario World. Unlike the Lost Levels, the developers clearly now have a good idea of what works, and they polish to make these same conventions established in the original Super Mario Bros. Absolutely shine. There's still innovation and fun, but it's around a set structure: the courses, the power-ups, the difficulty levels. The third stage is the parody phase. As traditional genre staples go from iconic to slightly cliche, people start trying to subvert expectations. Again, we can see this in Mario as we move to the mid-90s. Nintendo are hardly likely to create a more perfect version of 2D Mario than Super Mario World, but they wanted to start breaking out, and so with Yoshi's Island, Wario Land, and of course the 3D version of the series, they turn lots of things on its head. Wario, by all reports, seemed to have been created explicitly as a parody of Mario, which might explain why Nintendo don't seem particularly keen to rush Wario Land back out onto the shelves. Finally, the genre reaches the deconstruction phase, where the old rules can be broken and multiple genres merge together. And really, what is Super Mario Bros. Wonder but a deconstruction of the gameplay styles we've seen before, with infusions of rhythm games, with top-down sections, and more innovations. Now, note that this isn't a story of decay, it's just a process of change. Look at a mechanic like crafting. Crafting was once the preserve of strategy or realistic sim games, but now series as diverse as Animal Crossing, Zelda, and Xenoblade all have some kind of crafting mechanic in recent games. And sure, you've long been able to dress up in a wide variety of clothes on your Animal Crossing island, but Splatoon, Mario, Zelda, and others all have this mechanic now as well. What could in some respects seem like a homogenization is more a recognition that certain commonalities and gameplay techniques can be applied across a wide variety of series with some success. Another that I've noticed a lot recently is being able to take photographs in game. Not any longer just an obsession of Instagrammers, now even in Nintendo games the facility is frequently built in for you to be able to stand and take the perfect shot. In this sense, I think it's fair to say that we're very much into the deconstruction stage for a lot of game genres, and this does bring with it some degree of homogenization as lots of the same features start to cross over. I think we also have to be, as Commonwealth Realm might say, brutally honest and reflect on the fact that Nintendo will not be able to continue innovating with the same success forever. I hope that they stay as awesome as they've currently been for at least my lifetime, but I doubt that during the heat death of the universe, people are still going to be as wowed by Super Mario Entropy. For each game to feel like a new departure from what has gone before, there are some levers they still have to pull. Firstly, they can look to give their games new contexts. This was something we saw a lot in the 2000s. What about a Zelda game, but it's on the sea, in the sky, in the Twilight Realm? What about Mario, but he has a water pistol or is in space? What about Metroid Prime, but Samus has an evil twin or goes between multiple planets? All of this has a problem, though. If the games are relatively infrequent, you risk alienating a chunk of the audience who really wants something a bit more traditional, and it could be a long time given current game development approaches before you can come back for another bite of the cherry. So we see a revision of this approach in recent titles like Donkey Kong Bonanza, Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, and Super Mario Bros. Wonder, where the new contexts provide for extremely diverse interactions. The Wonder Flower allowed them to cudgel in numerous custom-designed experiences, whereas Tears of the Kingdom's Ultra Hand was kind of the opposite in that it really bestowed upon the player something that their imagination could run wild with. But both were examples of giving a new device or prism through which to view gameplay which we've become so familiar with. Another change Nintendo has pulled before is technological. I think it can be argued that there are two major technological cliff edges in Nintendo's history, and we're still living through the second. The first, of course, was the transition from 2D sprite-based gaming, reigning supreme up to the end of the Super NES era, and then the move to polygonal 3D. Super Mario 64, Zelda Ocarina of Time, and Metroid Prime are generally considered to be separate genres from Super Mario World, Zelda A Link to the Past, and Super Metroid, even though they share considerable amounts of DNA and even narrative and gameplay elements in many cases. Now, Mario, Zelda, and Metroid have both 3D and 2D series, although since even the 2D series are rendered in 3D, even that description now seems old hat. But another change has been the move to truly open world gameplay. Zelda Breath of the Wild is a marked and seemingly permanent change from the linear style of Zelda, and while Mario Kart World is very much a traditional Mario Kart game in many respects, the open world aspects really do give a completely different kind of experience than anything we've come across before. It's unlikely that all titles will embrace full openness, but even the more limited and guarded openness of a title like Super Mario Odyssey contrasts with the Mario games from 2007 to 2013, which were course-based 3D titles rather than sandbox experiences like, to be fair, Mario 64 and Super Mario Sunshine already were. In many respects, I feel like this era is an echo of the Super NES as a result. Whereas the original NES had some truly classic titles, it was the sequel system that made games seem to perfect the form, and perhaps one reason the developers of Switch 2 felt comfortable focusing so much on the increase in power as opposed to some broad, innovative leap is the one that they claim, which is that the developers had ideas which just needed more power to put out. Similarly, though to a somewhat lesser extent, in Switch's first era, there was a wave of titles that Nintendo called rethinking the conventions titles. Breath of the Wild rethought the conventions of Zelda, Kirby and the Forgotten Land rethought the conventions of Kirby, Zelda Echoes of Wisdom rethought top-down Zelda, and so on. Now that's not to say that all titles use this innovative approach. With Famicom Detective Club, there was clearly a more gradual evolution, and Metroid Dread was in many respects very traditional, despite the fact that there was an absolutely cutting-edge graphical quality to it, and with a brilliant and mechanically interesting villain in the Emmy Robot. I'd argue these titles are still in their classic phases in many respects if we go back to that four-stage genre theory, largely because the juice had never been fully squeezed out from their concepts in the first place. On the other hand, Donkey Kong Bonanza seems to be a great example of a game that exists at the final end of the genre cycle because it takes expectations, such as that platformers have fixed platforms, and subverts them by making everything smashable. It is a Mario-style game but includes climbing, has both country-style side-scrollers but also Dandori challenge-style puzzle levels. It's not a game that is worried about drilling down and perfecting a style of game that has already been long established before, but rather it's focused on creating something new by mashing up lots and lots of different other elements. Now, to a degree, that's inevitable because Donkey Kong has never had a game quite like this one, but of course, there are plenty of precedents for Donkey Kong games from Donkey Kong 64 to Jungle Beat to the country titles. It's just that the team have chosen to wear that past very lightly and look at things through a fresh lens. And I don't mind that some things seem to be taken from other games. People have commented about the similarities with Zelda, but to me, it just makes sense to bring in the things that work through the prism of Donkey Kong. Zelda is going to be a really interesting franchise from this point of view, though. The trouble with rethinking the conventions of your franchise is that at the end you get new conventions, and that became very obvious with Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, which, love it though I do, in many respects was a structural paint by numbers of Breath of the Wild. It has become the template game that Ocarina of Time was for so long, and I will be very interested to see to what degree the Zelda team try to make innovation a more regular feature, and to what degree they just utilize the power of the new console to make a new game in the same footprint, but that is simply vaster and more impressive. I suspect with the chemistry and physics engines of the Wild games, there remains space to explore and develop and establish new conventions, but it's still possible that we could start to see these be deconstructed. And of course, not everything may stick. Nintendo has suggested that Ultra Hand mechanics won't necessarily be in the next game, although I have to say that there is a risk the world feels less interactive without them, which would be an anathema for a Zelda title of the modern form. Splatoon is another interesting one. Because it's a relatively new franchise, Splatoon Raiders feels like the first attempt to take us into what Metz would describe as the parody phase, taking the core principles of the original game and giving them a far more major twist. I feel like this is something Animal Crossing did successfully with Happy Home Designer, but hasn't really achieved since. New Horizons was great and did innovate in many ways, but there are a lot of features which still feel rooted in past titles, and I wonder if and when Nintendo will decide that they need a Rethinking the Conventions title for the Animal Crossing series. I doubt it will be quite yet, given the newfound popularity of the title and the capacity of so many other elements from different games to be brought in, but they will need to double down to make the next game a true classic. An advantage Nintendo has, of course, is that it has so many franchises that it can put out different titles at different stages. It can remake classics alongside bold and experimental titles, something we saw with, for example, the 1-2 punch of Kirby and the Forgotten Land and Kirby Return to Dreamland Deluxe, or Fire Emblem Three Houses with its detailed monastery mechanics as opposed to the far more direct strategy action of Fire Emblem Engage. Indeed, I think it's arguable that Nintendo has spawned sub-series as a result of this kind of cell division process of its genres. We've already talked about the 3D and so-called 2D versions of Mario, Zelda, and Metroid separating out in the late 90s and early noughties, but check out Mario Maker, which has also kind of branched off from the 2D games as its own separate genre in many respects. Mario Kart World is very steady as she goes in terms of its core karting aspects, but renders those with far more lavish detail and attention than ever before. It's a true perfection of the type of game that has preceded it. Donkey Kong Bonanza is a case of tearing up the rulebook and starting again. Both types can coexist, but more importantly, both need to coexist for Nintendo to manage to do well in the long term. They need the seed corn for future ideas, and it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest to see more examples of teams subdividing their existing genres so that smaller groups can do experimental projects that may never come to pass, but occasionally will be the saving grace of the company. We've had hints that Nintendo does have lots of smaller projects like this on the go at one time or another, with ARMS and Splatoon being two examples of the fruits of that labour, as well as Ring Fit and others. Was Bowser's Fury the outcome of such a process? We may not know unless it's referred to in an interview, but it would make sense if this was happening. As for Nintendo's consoles, I think there is probably a natural law of diminishing returns that comes into play for Nintendo in terms of major innovations. The Switch 2 is the product of decades of their best ideas and bears the hallmarks of dozens of past innovations. Occasionally, as with the Wii, you need to take a step back to try something new, but generally Nintendo has preferred to add or restore things to make a console that feels like the response of a long dialogue with the public about what feels like an awesome system to play. This is why I feel it's likely that Nintendo's next mad ideas will come via accessories rather than by system innovation, and why, for a time at least, Nintendo may seem a little less weird and out there than they have been at times in their past. If you would like to subscribe, or check out the Patreon, I'd be so grateful. But otherwise, I'm just happy you're here, and I will look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.